So welcome back to the third part of the lecture. This is going to be very brief and it's very practical. So the first question I think we need to ask ourselves before we go and visit a museum or any kind of external site is, why are we going there? So as with all effective history teaching, we have to be clear about the learning intentions so that we can develop a clear rationale for our visit. So here are some questions to get started. Think about how the visit will feed into the unit of work as a whole. What contribution will it make? Is this going to be an early taster to open up a new topic, or is this going to be a visit that happens at the midpoint and provides a case study that we can use to develop children's understanding, or just to sustain their motivation, to keep their interest up as they get halfway through a longer topic? Or is this going to be a visit that happens at the end of a period of study, and the aim therefore is to deepen their understanding and to apply their knowledge more critically? If you think about a visit to the museum, we'll plan a very different visit if this is to open up a new topic and just to get some sense of time. Whereas if we spent 2 months studying a topic, then we're going to go in and be much more critical and engage with higher level interpretations. So what key content are we going to gain through the study of this site? What key knowledge are we going to use, consolidate or extend? So we need to think very clearly about what we're bringing and what we're going to be taking away from this site visit. The other thing to think about is, in terms of knowledge, what substantive concepts will we develop? Religion, diversity, power, governance, culture, technology, for example, but also what historical concepts will we develop? These are the kinds of things we talked about in the long lectures: causation, significance, change, evidential understanding, chronology, sorry, I've got significance there again, interpretation. Once we've got our learning focus, then we need to think about how involved the children will be. So Snelson, in an article in 2007, gives an example of sharing the planning of a trip to a large church called the Minster in York. She had been doing the same trip for a number of years and she just felt it became quite boring. She went to the big church and she went to a smaller house. They did a comparison. She prepared a worksheet for the children to fill out, but she really felt they went, they filled it in, they came back to school, very little was gained from it. So she decided to throw that work out and she started from scratch. This time she taught them a bit about the church and medieval society, and then she spent a whole lesson getting the children to talk about what they wanted to find out when they went to this huge church, to the Minster. So in this discussion, she let them talk about whatever they were interested in. Some of it was more historical, some of it was less historical, and towards the end, she asked them to focus on the big, overarching, and more obviously historical question. And they arrived at the question, how important was the Minster to the medieval city of York? Then she helped them by posing some themes, or what she calls medium-term questions. So the big question is, how important was the Minster to the medieval city? The medium-term question is, how does this tell us something about power in medieval society? What does this tell us about how people built large buildings in medieval society? What does this tell us about medieval work? So she helped to pose those kind of the mid-range questions, but then she let the children generate their own small questions. And there are some examples in the blue box here. So these are children's questions. How many candles did it take to light the building? What sorts of jobs do people do in the building, etc. So they came up with more specific questions, but each set of questions could feed into these themes about power, building, technology, work, and then each of those is going to be helpful in coming up with the answer to the big question, how important was the Minster? So involving children is obviously a very helpful way, and it helps to create some sense of kind of motivation and engagement, but we also need to think about how we're going to prepare the students more specifically. So developing questions and problems, as we've just seen, is useful. If you have a problem, then it begs an answer or a solution, and so going to a site to try and find out the answer just creates a sense of motivation. We might also prepare students by showing them a video of the site or of the themes that they're going to explore, just so they're beginning to think about the kinds of issues, getting into the mindset for the visit. We might just do a simple brainstorm of what we know and what we want to know, so that that can help focus children ahead of the visit. And we might give them a more straightforward briefing, where we set out expectations, we set the rules, we tell them what equipment they need to bring, we set the timings, so that we're always working towards a very practical framework. So then we need to think about what we're going to ask the students to do when they're there. I think here you can ask them to do anything really, but it's just worth being conscious that there's a balance to strike. If we are too specific, for example by giving lots and lots of teacher worksheets with gaps where you just need to go and read the information and fill the gaps in, then that can become boring and unengaging. There's little scope for children to engage in more creative ways with the evidence they see around them. But if we make it completely unstructured and just say to children, go and find out what's interesting, then it will lose focus and they'll also get bored. So we need to discuss in advance with the children what the focus is, what the purpose is, and then make sure that children know what it is they should be doing while they're there and how we'd expect them to collect some information that they can bring back to school so they've got some evidence they can use later on in their further studies. So I think within those two extremes we need to find a middle ground, and obviously we'll set these up differently depending on the age and maturity and capability of the students. Then we need to think about how we're going to follow up. So always make sure there's time back in class to debrief and follow up. The trip is just an experience and we can't assume that students are going to learn from it, and we certainly can't assume what they're going to learn from it. So we need some further activities to process that information and move from experience to identifying the learning. So we can do this in simple ways. We can have a class discussion, we can ask students to present their key findings, we can put students into different groups so they combine different thematic accounts and come to a more holistic account of the site visit. We can ask them to produce individual reports detailing their answers to the questions or their solutions to the problems that we set before we went there. Or we can find something more creative. We can ask them to design a monument, to design an alternative site, to create a model of the place, to write a leaflet, to design a poster, whatever it might be. But the key thing is each of those should be focused so we know what the history learning is, and each provides a different mechanism for distilling some learning from the overall experience. And then finally we need to be able to reassure ourselves that this was worth the effort. So this means establishing some means of assessment. Any of the previous outputs could be accessible, but the issue is always to be clear what criteria we're going to use to make our judgment. So the criteria clearly in one sense need to be related to learning intentions. If we establish these at the outset, then we can use them again when we come to review how successful it was. The bottom line is it was successful if it helped children demonstrate they met the learning intentions. But Coles and colleagues, talking about site visits in a local history project, also made the point that if, as they did, you framed the visit around a problem or an investigation, in their case it was to look at whether a local rich landowner 500 years ago was a hero or a villain, was a good man or a bad man. For them, the criteria, the overwhelming criteria for assessment wasn't whether the students thought he was good or bad, it was the sophistication of the justification they gave to support their case and the extent to which they were able to use the evidence they'd encountered during the site visits. So if you start with a problem, then that's a kind of fairly generic framework you could use to assess the extent to which the children engage with the learning. So here are the extra references I've drawn on for this final part of the lecture. There's no work that you have to do this week. You're still working on assignments and thinking about your planning. What I've suggested in the handbook is that if you have the opportunity, it would be useful just to review a scheme of work and to think about a site visit to a location, a building, a park, a museum, a gallery, wherever you think would be interesting, something that you could integrate into a scheme of work and where you think it would be enriching as an activity, and just to share with me on the discussion forum one or two suggestions as to places you could go and why you think they would be useful ways to enrich the curriculum that's already planned.